Francois, definitely a pleasure speaking to you. Let's just start off with that a bit of news on Ethiopia leading the growth, a real GDP of 8.1%. How far back does this research track? Because we know if we were to go by the current stand on Ethiopia, that would actually lead to the 8.1. But how far back is your research?
Well, if you go back a decade, then Ethiopian GDP growth averaged double digits for probably 8 of the past 10 years. I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but 8% real GDP growth for them in historical terms is a bit of a come down. But of course, as they've grown richer, the actual amount of value added that's been added every year has stayed relatively constant. And of course, by any standards, that's a very impressive number for GDP growth.
Right. In regards to what's happening region by region, before we get into some specifics of what you mentioned about Kenya, Egypt is the main driver behind North Africa's 3.9% GDP growth. But this has been made possible by some compliance reforms courtesy of the IMF. Now, they did the same reforms across different regions. Why are we seeing this being picked up or being more favorable for other parts of the continent?
Well, Egypt, I think, a lot of the explanation is that the reforms that the IMF helped them with or sort of provided the impetus for them to end up doing were things that everyone understood had to be done in Egypt, and everyone was waiting for the government to do them. I'm talking going back more than a decade. Even in the late 90s, people were already talking about devaluing the pound and cutting spending on subsidies. But there hadn't been until the end of 2016, really, the political will or a government in place that wanted and could do that without facing a very severe popular backlash. Now, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's government is that government, and so they were able to do what everyone understood needed to be done. And immediately, once that had been done, you saw portfolio flows flow into Egypt. And then the weaker pound makes Egypt's exports, especially of manufactured goods, more competitive. So that's the downside of this, obviously, is that Egyptians are finding themselves hit when they go shopping because imported goods are more expensive. And then all the goods that had previously been subsidized, cooking oil and fuel especially, are now more expensive. But they've gone through the toughest part of it, and now, from now on, even though consumers are still complaining that they don't have as much spending power as they used to, in terms of employment and then the macroeconomic fundamentals of the country, it is looking a lot better. In other countries where the IMF came in and made the same prescriptions, perhaps the government sector wasn't as big in the economy. Firstly, that's the difference between Egypt and the rest of Africa. And the second big difference is that Egypt's economy is more formalized than the economies of other African countries. So reforms that touch on regulations and the way firms do business do have more profound macro effects than they would in a country where a lot of trading is informal.
Right, let's touch on Kenya because that's one of the most interesting bits within your report. You've placed it a bit higher. The GDP, you've said, is set to hit 5.7% despite the debt burden. This is a bit higher than some of the international bodies. World Bank, 5.5%, African Development Bank, about 5.6%, 2018, 6.2% next year. What's the rationale that should out-hit this target?
Well, we're looking at output in 2018 compared to output in 2017, and our reasoning is that the better harvest is going to boost both the primary and secondary sector. So you're going to see a lot more revenues come in through agriculture, exports of agricultural goods than last year because the harvest, we expect a better harvest, and then thanks to what's happening with farming goods, then the agro-processing sector is going to do better. Thinking about meat and fruit canning, thinking about maize, milling, and sugar refinery. So we expect all those businesses then to have a better time of it thanks to what's happening on the farming sector. and then that is going to boost manufacturing sector value added. And those two parts of the economy, I want to say, the primary and secondary sector, account for so much of Kenyan spending power through the employment of people who work in them, that we think that is going to flow through into the economy in spending power and ultimately value added to a greater extent than our peers at the IMF seem to believe.
Right, let's talk about the countries in the franc zone. We'd think by now, since we're talking about higher oil prices boosting the fortune of hydrocarbon-dependent economies, that they'd be able to outpace East Africa particularly, since we know that oil production or oil revenue generation in our side of the world has not yet started to come to fruition. But they're still way behind, 4.5%. That's almost 2% a gap in GDP growth projections. That's huge, Francois.
Yes. So the thing is that oil prices are higher than they were, but they're definitely nowhere near the $100 plus barrel prices that we were seeing in 2013. So we aren't going to go back to that. And also the oil price is only increasing quite slowly. And it takes time in a very oil-dependent economy like, say, Nigeria's, it takes time for that kind of for the oil dollars to flow back into the economy through, it mostly goes in through government spending, doesn't it? Through infrastructure projects and then employment in the public sector. So we don't think that this year already there's going to have been time for. It is true that government revenues from oil are going to be higher, but they won't have time to push that through to the economy in a way that significantly boosts growth. And then because of the now 3.5 years of lower oil prices, there are liquidity issues in terms of the availability of foreign exchange in all these oil-dependent countries, and especially ones that aren't in the franc zone. So the franc zone obviously is a bit special, but the oil-dependent economies like Angola and Nigeria, there just aren't enough dollars to go around, and this complicates life for importers, for everyone. Foreign investors hesitate to come in because they don't know if they're going to be able to get paid back. And you know the difficulties related to the thinness of the availability of foreign exchange affects the economy in a whole lot of ways. So that's why we continue to think that the best economies, or the economies that are going to show the strongest performance over the year, are the ones that are least dependent on oil, the most diversified ones. And those are the East African economies, as we highlight in the report.